After my husband passed away, my sister revealed that her child's father was actually my husband, and she demanded half of the inheritance. I didn't believe her until I saw what she had to show. I stood in my sister's cramped apartment, surrounded by pastel balloons and the sticky smell of grocery store cake, wondering how I'd managed to show up at all. It had been 9 days since I buried my husband, 9 days since I watched them lower the casket into the ground while rain hammered against my black umbrella. 9 days since my entire world collapsed into a grief so profound I could barely remember to breathe. The apartment was packed with people I barely recognized. Her boyfriend's friends mostly. Young 20-somethings drinking cheap beer and laughing too loud. My nephew sat in his high chair, face covered in blue frosting, chubby hands grabbing at everything within reach, completely oblivious to the fact that his first birthday party would become the day everything in our family shattered beyond repair. I hadn't wanted to come. Every part of me had screamed to stay home, to avoid the pitying looks and awkward condolences that would inevitably follow me around the party. But my mother had called 3 times that morning, her voice tight with that particular tone that meant she wouldn't take no for an answer. Family obligations, she'd said. Your sister needs you there. So I'd forced myself into a dark dress, pulled my hair into something resembling order, and driven across town with a stuffed elephant I'd bought online at 2 a.m. during one of my many sleepless nights. My sister moved through the crowd with an energy that seemed almost manic, her laugh too bright, her gestures too big. She'd always been like this. Everything amplified, everything performance. When we were kids, she couldn't just tell a story, she had to act it out. Now, watching her work the room, I felt that familiar exhaustion. Vera! She appeared in front of me suddenly, gripping my arm with fingers that dug in too hard. Her perfume was overwhelming, something cheap and floral. You came. I wasn't sure you would after everything. Of course I came, I said quietly. He's my nephew. Her eyes glittered with something I couldn't quite identify. Right. Your nephew. That's so sweet of you to say. Before I could respond, she'd spun away, clapping her hands together to get everyone's attention. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. My parents, standing near the kitchen doorway, exchanged worried glances. Thank you all so much for coming to celebrate my baby's first birthday, she announced. It means the world to me, especially during this difficult time, when we've lost someone so important to our family. I felt my chest tighten. Please don't do this here, I thought. Not today. My sister just lost her husband, she continued, gesturing toward me. Several heads turned in my direction. It's been so hard on all of us. He was such a wonderful man, so generous, so caring, especially to me. The way she said that last part made my skin crawl. There was an insinuation in her tone, something poisonous lurking beneath the surface. Which is why, she said, pulling a folded envelope from her back pocket, I think it's time everyone knew the truth. I've been carrying this secret for too long, and with him gone, there's no reason to hide it anymore. My father stepped forward. Maybe this isn't the right time. This is exactly the right time, she cut him off sharply. Because my sister needs to know that the man she thought was her faithful husband was actually the father of my son. The words hung there like smoke from a fire. I heard someone gasp. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. The room had gone so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. I stared at her, waiting for this to make sense somehow. That's not possible, I heard myself say. You're lying. I have proof, she said, waving the envelope. A DNA test. And more than that, I have his will, the real one. He left instructions. Half of everything goes to his son. Half of that $2 million house goes to my baby. She looked so confident, so absolutely certain of herself, and I felt something unexpected bubble up in my chest. Not tears, not the devastation she clearly expected, but something else entirely. I laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. It was sharp and bitter, scraping its way out of my throat, because despite the horror of what she was claiming, I knew something she didn't. Something that made her elaborate lie fall apart. You think that's funny? She demanded. You think I'm making this up? I think, I said, my voice stronger than it had been in days, that you've made a very serious mistake. She faltered. Just for a second. Doubt flickered before the mask of certainty returned. The only mistake was keeping quiet this long. That house, that money, half of it belongs to my son, and I'm going to make sure he gets what he deserves. I met her eyes and saw everything. The desperation, the greed, the conviction that she'd found her way out. We'll see, I said. My sister hoisted my nephew onto her hip. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. Enjoy that big house while you can. Soon, half of it will be mine. As I walked out, I felt something shift. The grief fog cleared, replaced by sharp focus. She'd forgotten one crucial thing, and that knowledge was about to change everything. I met him 12 years ago at a charity auction, back when I still believed in fate and serendipity, and all those romantic notions that feel foolish now. The event was one of those overcrowded affairs where local professionals pretended to care about literacy, while really just networking and drinking overpriced wine. I'd gone with a colleague who ditched me within 15 minutes. I was standing alone, studying a donated painting of a lighthouse that I had absolutely no intention of bidding on, when he appeared beside me. "It's terrible, isn't it?" he'd said, offering me a glass of champagne with a smile that seemed genuinely warm. "Absolutely awful," I'd agreed. "But admitting that feels wrong at a charity event. I won't tell if you don't." We spent the rest of the evening talking, ignoring the auction and speeches. He was a corporate lawyer, he told me, specializing in contract negotiations. The work was boring but paid well. I told him about my marketing job, about the campaign that was slowly driving me insane. We talked about books and terrible movies and whether the city's new downtown development was visionary or just gentrification. By the end of the night, I had his number and a date scheduled for that weekend. Within 6 months, we'd moved in together. Within a year, we were married in a small ceremony at a botanical garden. Nothing extravagant. That wasn't who we were. We bought the Victorian house 2 years after we married. It had been a foreclosure, a complete disaster of peeling paint and rotting floorboards. But he'd seen the potential immediately. We spent weekends stripping wallpaper and refinishing hardwood floors. He learned to tile bathrooms from online videos. I developed a talent for choosing paint colors that actually worked together. The house became our shared mission. We turned the third bedroom into my home office. We renovated the kitchen with pale blue cabinets and butcher block counters. We planted rose bushes along the front fence and installed a porch swing where we'd sit on summer evenings. It was a good life. Stable, comfortable, happy. Or at least, that's what I believed. The problem started 3 years into our marriage when we began trying for a baby. The first year felt casual, almost fun. When nothing happened, we saw a doctor. Tests revealed I had endometriosis. The doctor recommended IVF, said our chances were good. The first round failed, so did the second. The third time, I got pregnant, carried for 6 weeks, and then miscarried on a Tuesday morning while he was in a meeting downtown. I called him from the emergency room bathroom, and he left immediately. He held my hand while the doctor confirmed what we already knew. The fourth round was our last attempt. We'd spent close to $80,000 by that point, emptied our savings, took out a loan against the house. The emotional toll was worse than the financial one. Every injection, every appointment, every 2-week wait felt like torture. When that final test came back negative, we'd both known we were done. We spent months grieving the future we'd imagined. The nursery we'd never decorate, the parent-teacher conferences we'd never attend, the chaos of family life that would never be ours. It felt like mourning a death, except the person we were mourning had never existed. Eventually, we adjusted. We had to. We renovated the room we'd mentally designated as a nursery, turning it into a reading nook with built-in bookshelves. We started traveling more. Long weekends in Charleston, 2 weeks in Portugal, spontaneous drives up the coast. We focused on our careers, on each other. The marriage settled into something comfortable. We had our routines. We didn't fight much. When we did, it was usually about something mundane, like whose turn it was to call the plumber. Looking back now, I wonder if I was too comfortable, too trusting, too willing to believe that what we had was solid and real. My sister had always been on the periphery of our life together. She'd been erratic even back then, dropping out of college, moving from job to job, dating men who were always either too intense or completely unreliable. He'd been patient with her in those early years. When she needed money for rent, he'd slip her a few $100s. When her car broke down, he'd spent a Saturday helping her. He was kind to her, but distant. Polite, but never warm. I'd appreciated that distance. When she got pregnant 3 years ago, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Jealousy, definitely. Sharp and bitter, especially so soon after our final failed IVF. But also concern, because she was barely holding her life together. Her boyfriend, the bartender she'd been seeing on and off, seemed shocked but committed. He proposed awkwardly at a family dinner with a ring that looked like it came from a pawn shop. My mother cried happy tears while my father looked uncomfortable. My husband had been quiet that night, withdrawn. When I asked about it later, he said he was fine, just tired. But I'd noticed how he barely touched his food, how he'd made excuses to leave early. I'd thought it was about the baby, about watching my sister get pregnant so easily while we'd spent years failing. Now I wonder if I read it all wrong. My sister and I had never been close, not even as children. There's a 5-year gap between us, just enough distance that we never occupied the same social circles or shared the same interests. While I was studying for college entrance exams, she was still in middle school, experimenting with increasingly alarming hair colors and dating boys our parents didn't approve of. But the real wedge between us wasn't age, it was temperament. I'd always been the steady one, the planner, the daughter who did what was expected. Good grades, stable job, sensible life choices. She was the chaos, the drama, the one who called home at 2 a.m. needing bail money or a place to crash. Our parents enabled her, I thought. Every time she crashed and burned, they were there to catch her, to make excuses, to give her another chance. Meanwhile, I'd paid my own way through college, built my career without family connections, bought my first car with money I'd saved. The jealousy went both ways. I was jealous of the attention she got. She was jealous of my success, my stability, my marriage to a man who had his life together. It manifested in small, petty ways. When I got promoted, she'd make comments about how boring corporate work must be. When we bought the house she visited once, walked through every room and said it felt cold and sterile. When I mentioned our infertility struggles, she changed the subject within seconds. So when she got pregnant, the universe's irony felt particularly cruel. Here I was, 31 years old, financially stable, in a solid marriage, desperate for a child I couldn't have. And there she was, 26, living in a cramped apartment with a boyfriend who worked inconsistent bar hours, accidentally pregnant after what she described as not even trying. The pregnancy announcement happened at a family dinner. She'd pulled a sonogram photo from her purse, slid it across the table, and watched as our mother burst into tears of joy. My father had shaken her boyfriend's hand with gruffness that masked emotion. Everyone was so happy, so excited. I'd excused myself to the bathroom and cried silently into a towel for 10 minutes. My husband had found me there, knocked softly, and waited until I opened the door. "I know this is hard," he'd said quietly. "We can leave whenever you want." But we hadn't left. We'd stayed through dessert, through my mother's excited planning about baby showers and nursery colors. We'd smiled and nodded and said all the right things. On the drive home, neither of us spoke. When we got to the house, he'd gone straight to his office and closed the door. I'd found him there 3 hours later, staring at his computer screen without really seeing it. I tried to be a good aunt. I really did. I went to the baby shower, bought presents from the registry, helped paint the nursery in her cramped apartment. When the baby was born, I visited the hospital, held the tiny wrinkled thing, and felt my heart simultaneously break and expand. But my husband didn't visit the hospital. He sent flowers and a card, made excuses about work being busy, about not wanting to intrude. My mother had frowned at his absence, but I'd defended him, said he was giving them space. Looking back, I should have questioned that. Should have wondered why a man who'd been so eager to become a father suddenly wanted nothing to do with his infant nephew. But I'd assumed it was the same pain I felt, that seeing the baby was a reminder of what we'd lost. As the baby grew, the dynamic only got stranger. My sister started calling me constantly, asking if I could babysit, help with doctor's appointments, pick up diapers on my way over. She treated me like a built-in support system, and I went. Not because I particularly enjoyed spending time with her, but because I loved my nephew. He was sweet and smiley, reaching chubby hands toward my face, laughing at peekaboo games. My husband never came with me on those visits. If I suggested bringing him along, he'd suddenly have work to catch up on, calls to make, errands to run. The few times my sister brought the baby to our house, he'd stay in his office, only emerging briefly to say hello before retreating. "He's just not a baby person," my sister had said once, bouncing the baby on her hip in our kitchen. But there was something in her tone, something almost smug that made my skin prickle. "He wanted to be a father," I'd said defensively. Right. She'd adjusted the baby's outfit, not meeting my eyes. But wanting to be a father and actually dealing with kids are different things. The comment had stung. I'd asked her to leave shortly after. There were other strange moments, too. Times when she'd show up at our house unannounced, always when she somehow knew my husband was home. Times when I'd catch them talking in hushed voices that stopped the moment I entered the room. At a family barbecue last summer, I'd gone inside to refill drinks and came back to find them standing close together near the fence, her hand on his arm, both of them looking intense about something. When they noticed me, they'd jumped apart. "Just talking about the baby," she'd said quickly. He was asking about his development milestones. But he'd never asked me about those things. The whole interaction felt off, staged. That night, lying in bed, I'd rolled over to face him. Is something going on with my sister? What do you mean? His voice in the darkness sounded carefully neutral. You guys have been talking a lot lately. Acting weird? She's your sister. I'm trying to be supportive. It was the right answer. The answer I wanted to hear. So I'd let it drop, tried to sleep, tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. The first real warning sign came 3 years ago, at a dinner that should have been ordinary. We'd invited my sister over because my mother had been pestering me about spending more time with her, about being a better sister. My sister was between boyfriends at the time, going through what my mother called a rough patch. We'd made pasta, nothing fancy. She showed up an hour late, smelling like she'd stopped at a bar first, carrying a bottle of cheap wine that was already half empty. She wore a dress that seemed too tight, too low cut for a casual family dinner, but that was typical for her. Dinner started normally enough. We talked about surface things, her latest job at a salon, my current work project, house renovations we were planning. She drank most of the wine herself, refilling her glass faster than keep up. By the time we'd finished eating, her words were starting to slur slightly. I'd gotten a call from my office around 8, a crisis with a client campaign that needed immediate attention. I took it in the other room, pacing while I tried to manage the situation. The call lasted maybe 20 minutes. When I came back, something had shifted. My husband was standing in the kitchen, gripping the counter edge with white knuckles. My sister was leaning against the refrigerator, her expression oscillating between defiant and hurt. The air felt thick, charged with something uncomfortable. What happened? I asked, looking between them. My sister pushed off the refrigerator, grabbing her purse. Nothing. I should go. No. Wait. My husband's voice was tight, controlled in a way that meant he was working hard to stay calm. I think Vera needs to know what just happened. My sister's eyes flashed. Don't be dramatic. It was a joke. It wasn't a joke. He turned to me, and I saw something in his face I'd never seen before. A kind of careful, practiced concern that felt almost scripted. While you were on the phone, your sister made some inappropriate comments. And then she tried to kiss me. The words hung there, impossible to process. I looked at my sister, waiting for her to deny it. Instead, she laughed bitterly. Oh, please. You're making it sound like I attacked you. I made a comment about you looking good. Is that a crime? You told me my wife didn't appreciate me, he said evenly. You said you'd noticed how distant we'd been lately. And then you touched my chest and tried to kiss me. I was drunk. She threw her hands up. I'm obviously drunk. It didn't mean anything. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. You need to leave. Vera. Leave. Now. She'd grabbed her things and stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the pictures on the wall. My husband and I had stood in the kitchen, the tension slowly draining from the room. I'm sorry, he'd said finally. I didn't want to make things worse between you two, but I thought you should know. You did the right thing. I'd moved to him, put my arms around him. Thank you for telling me. But even then, something felt off about the whole thing. The timing of his revelation, the way he'd laid out the story so clearly, it felt rehearsed, like he'd been practicing what to say. But I'd pushed that feeling down, buried it beneath my anger at my sister. In the weeks that followed, there were text messages. She'd send them late at night, apologizing, making excuses, then getting angry when he didn't respond the way she wanted. He showed me every message, kept the phone between us on the couch, maintained complete transparency. She's spiraling, I'd said, reading through another rambling message. I think she might need help, professional help. There were other incidents, too. She'd show up at his office downtown, claiming she was in the neighborhood and wanted to apologize in person. He'd tell me about it immediately, frustration clear in his voice. She'd call him during work hours, leave voicemails that started apologetic and ended accusatory. She's obsessed with you, I'd said after another such incident. I think we need to talk to your parents. This is getting out of hand. The family meeting had been horrible. My parents, my sister, my husband, and me, all sitting in my parents' living room while accusations flew. My sister had cried, claimed she was being vilified for one drunken mistake, said she'd apologized repeatedly. My husband had been calm, rational, presenting his side with the kind of clarity that comes from telling the truth, or from having rehearsed it perfectly. My parents had ultimately sided with us. My sister was told to stay away, to stop contacting him, to respect our marriage. She'd left that meeting furious, slamming their front door. For a few months, there was peace. She stopped texting, stopped showing up places. I thought maybe she'd finally moved on. Then she got pregnant. And suddenly she was back in our lives, needing help, needing support. My parents insisted we put the past behind us. That family forgave. So we did. We forgave, or at least pretended to. We showed up for the baby shower, sent gifts, and my husband maintained his distance, which seemed like the right thing after what had happened. I never questioned his version of events. Never wondered if maybe the story had been more complicated. I trusted him completely. That trust, I'm learning now, might have been the biggest mistake of my life. The secret that changed everything happened 4 years ago, though I didn't understand its significance at the time. My husband had been having urological problems. Painful, persistent issues that he'd been ignoring for months before finally seeing a specialist. The diagnosis required surgery. Minor procedure, the doctor had said, but with a complication. Due to the location and nature of the problem, they'd need to perform a vasectomy as part of the treatment. It was medically necessary, not optional. I remember sitting in that sterile office while the doctor explained the implications. My husband would be permanently unable to have biological children, given our history with infertility, given that we'd already exhausted our attempts at IVF. The doctor seemed to think this wouldn't be a major concern, but it felt like losing something we'd already lost, like closing a door that had already been closed, then nailing boards across it for good measure. We'd already decided we were done trying, my husband had said in the car afterward, his hands tight on the steering wheel. This doesn't change anything, right? Right, I'd agreed. We'd moved on. The surgery was scheduled for 2 weeks later. He took 3 days off work, spent them recovering on the couch while I brought him ice packs and prescription painkillers and tried not to think too hard about what this meant. What struck me as odd, though, was how thorough he wanted to be about documentation. He insisted on getting copies of all the medical records, the surgical notes, the post-operative reports. He filed them meticulously in our home safe. Why do we need all of this? I'd asked, watching him organize papers into labeled folders. Just being prepared, he'd said. You never know when you might need medical records. For what? He'd looked at me then, and I remember thinking his expression was strange. Almost sad, but also resigned. You just never know, Vera. It's better to have documentation and not need it. It had seemed excessive at the time, paranoid even, but I'd chalked it up to his legal training, his tendency to think about worst-case scenarios. A month after the surgery, he'd scheduled an appointment with our family lawyer. He wanted to update our wills, he said, make sure everything was properly documented now that we'd definitively decided not to have children. I'd gone with him to that appointment. We'd sat in the lawyer's office with its dark wood paneling, going over beneficiaries and asset distribution and all the morbid details of who gets what when we die. My husband had been specific, almost obsessive, about the terms. Everything went to me if he died first. The house, the savings, his retirement accounts, his life insurance policy. Everything. No exceptions, no contingencies, no clauses about potential children or family members who might make claims. The lawyer had seemed mildly amused by how thorough he was being. Most couples your age don't think this much about estate planning. We've learned to prepare for the unexpected, my husband had said. He'd also insisted on including the medical records about the vasectomy in a separate envelope, sealed and stored with the will documents in a safe deposit box at the bank. This had seemed especially bizarre to me. Why would anyone need to know about your medical procedures? I'd asked. Just covering all bases, he'd said. You never know what might be relevant later. At the time, I'd thought he was being ridiculously overcautious. The vasectomy was a private medical matter. Why would it ever need to be legally documented? Looking back now, I understand. He wasn't being paranoid. He was being strategic. He knew something I didn't. He understood that there might come a time when proving he couldn't father a child would be crucial, when those medical records would be the only thing standing between me and someone trying to claim what was rightfully mine. The timing of it all makes sense now, in a horrible way. This was a year before the dinner where my sister supposedly made advances on him. 2 years before she got pregnant. He was already preparing, already building a paper trail. But protecting us from what? Exactly? From my sister's future claims? Did he suspect even then that something might happen between them? Or did he know something was already happening? The medical records sit in that safe deposit box right now, along with his meticulously organized will and a sealed letter he'd left for me. I haven't opened that letter yet. Haven't had the courage to read whatever final words he wanted me to know. But I know what those medical records say. I know what they prove. That vasectomy, performed 4 years ago, makes it biologically impossible for my husband to be the father of my nephew, who was conceived 2 years later. My sister can claim an affair. She can produce text messages and photos and whatever proof she has. She can stand up in front of our entire family and declare that they were together. But she can't change biology. She can't make his body do something it was physically incapable of doing. And that's the one fact that destroys her entire claim. The irony isn't lost on me. The procedure that felt like losing our last chance at parenthood, that's the very thing that's going to save me from losing everything to my sister's lies. Or are they lies? That's the question that keeps me up at night now. The affair might have been real, but the baby? That part, at least, is impossible. And impossible is the one thing even my sister's manipulation can't overcome. What I didn't realize at the time was just how thoroughly my husband had prepared for this exact scenario. It wasn't until after his death, when I finally opened that safe deposit box, that I understood the full extent of his planning. The box contained more than just medical records and a will. It held a complete documentation package, meticulously organized in labeled folders with dates and descriptions. Everything had been categorized, cross-referenced, stored with the kind of precision that spoke to his legal training. There were screenshots of text messages from my sister, printed and dated. Not all of them. He'd been selective, keeping only the ones that showed a pattern. The late-night messages after the dinner incident. The ones where she'd apologized, then gotten angry, then apologized again. The ones where she'd made veiled references to feelings he supposedly didn't return. He'd also kept a diary, but not a traditional one. It was more like a legal log, entries made sporadically over the course of 2 years. Brief, factual descriptions of interactions with my sister. June 15th, appeared at downtown coffee shop during morning break. Claimed coincidence. Conversation lasted 8 minutes before I left. August 3rd, called office line directly. Asked about legal advice regarding lease. Redirected to public legal aid resources. September 22nd, showed up at house while Vera was at work conference. Said she needed to talk about family situation. Did not let her inside. Conversation on porch lasted 12 minutes. The entries were clinical, emotionless, the kind of record-keeping someone does when they're building a case, or protecting themselves from accusations they know might be coming. But the most damning evidence, or the most protective, depending on how you looked at it, was a separate sealed envelope labeled, "In the event of paternity claims." Inside were copies of the vasectomy medical records, including the surgeon's notes, the pathology report, and a letter from his doctor explicitly stating that the procedure made him permanently sterile. There was also a second medical document dated from 8 months after the surgery, a fertility test confirming 0 sperm count. He'd gone back to have it verified, to have concrete proof that the procedure had been completely successful. He'd thought of everything. The legitimate will was there too, properly notarized and registered, leaving everything to me without exception. The language was clear and specific. All assets, including the house currently valued at approximately $2 million, all bank accounts, all investments, all personal property, to his wife Vera, exclusively. There was no mention of potential children, no contingency clauses for unknown heirs, no ambiguous language that could be twisted or reinterpreted. At the bottom of the box, underneath all the official documents and organized evidence, was a personal letter, cream-colored envelope, my name written in his distinctive handwriting. I'd held it for a long time that day, sitting in the bank's private viewing room, trying to decide if I was ready to read it. I wasn't. I'd put it back, closed the box, told the bank employee I needed more time, but I'd taken photographs of everything else. The medical records, the will, the diary entries, the text messages. I'd sent them all to my phone, backed them up to cloud storage, made sure I had multiple copies. Because even in my grief, even in my shock at discovering this level of preparation, I understood what my husband had done. He'd built an impenetrable legal defense, not just for himself, but for me. Every document in that box served a dual purpose. On one hand, it protected him from accusations. If my sister ever claimed he was the father of her child, here was irrefutable medical proof that he couldn't be. If she claimed an affair, here was his meticulous record of her pursuing him, of him maintaining boundaries. On the other hand, it protected me from losing everything. The will ensured no one could claim my assets. The medical records ensured no one could claim paternity. The diary established a pattern of harassment rather than mutual relationship. But there was something else in that documentation, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. An excessive thoroughness that went beyond simple caution. Why document so much if the medical records alone proved paternity was impossible? Why keep the diary if he had nothing to hide? Unless he did have something to hide. Unless the affair my sister claimed actually happened, and all this documentation wasn't about preventing false accusations, it was about managing true ones. Maybe he'd known an affair was coming, Or maybe it had already started. Maybe he understood that one day my sister would make her move, would try to claim what wasn't hers, and he wanted to ensure that even if she proved they'd been together, she couldn't prove the one thing that mattered most. The vasectomy became his insurance policy. He could have the affair, could do whatever he wanted because biology would always be his alibi. It was brilliant, in a horrible way. Calculating and careful and completely thorough. He'd protected me, yes, but he'd also protected himself. From consequences, from responsibility, from having to face what he might have done. And now he was gone, leaving me with this box full of evidence that answered some questions, but raised so many more. 3 weeks after the funeral, my parents insisted on a family dinner. A chance to talk, they said, to work through the shocking claims my sister had made at the birthday party, to find some path toward resolution before lawyers got involved. I arrived at their house with copies of the will from the safe deposit box, ready to prove my sister's document was a forgery. I had my lawyer's number saved in my phone. I felt confident, almost calm. I knew something she didn't. My sister arrived 20 minutes late, carrying a leather portfolio that looked expensive. Too expensive for someone who could barely afford her cramped apartment. She wore a dress I'd never seen before, her hair professionally styled. She looked like someone who'd just come from a business meeting. "Thanks for agreeing to meet," she said, sitting down at the table like she was chairing a board meeting. "I know this has been difficult for everyone." "You made it difficult," my father said gruffly. "Making those accusations at your son's birthday party, in front of everyone. I made them because they're true." She opened the portfolio, pulling out papers. "And I have proof, real proof, not just a DNA test and a will." I felt my stomach tighten, but kept my voice steady. "Whatever you have is irrelevant. I have the legitimate will, properly notarized and registered. Your document is a forgery." She smiled then, and it wasn't the smile of someone who'd been caught. It was the smile of someone holding all the cards. "The will might be fake," she admitted casually. "I'll be honest. I panicked after he died. Thought maybe he'd left something for our son, tried to create documentation that should have existed. That was stupid of me. But the affair? That was real." She slid a photo across the table. My hands shook as I picked it up. It was my husband and my sister, sitting close together in what looked like a restaurant booth. His arm was around her shoulders. She was leaning into him, laughing. They looked comfortable together. Intimate. "That's from 8 months ago," she said. "We went to that little Italian place on the east side, the one you always said was too far to drive to." My mother made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. "That could be innocent," I said, but my voice sounded hollow. "You could have run into each other. There are more." She pulled out another photo, then another. My husband and my sister walking together through a park, sitting in his car, visible through the windshield, standing close outside what looked like a hotel. My father pushed his chair back from the table. "This isn't possible." "It would. It did." She reached into the portfolio again, pulling out a phone. Not her regular phone. This one was older, a basic model. "And I can prove it." She unlocked it and turned the screen toward me. Text messages filled the display, conversations between two numbers I didn't recognize. But I recognized the writing style, the particular way my husband phrased things. "I miss you already. Last night was incredible. Can't stop thinking about you. When can I see you again?" "She's at that conference in Atlanta until Friday. We could have the whole weekend." That last one made my vision blur. I'd been at a conference in Atlanta 7 months ago. 3 days of presentations. I'd called him every night. Told him I missed him. Looked forward to coming home. And while I was gone, he'd been making plans with my sister. "Keep scrolling," she said. Her voice almost gentle now. Almost pitying. I didn't want to scroll. But my fingers moved anyway, swiping through conversation after conversation. Plans to meet. Complaints about having to hide. Declarations that this was real. That what they had mattered. "This is the phone he used to contact me," my sister explained. "He kept it in his desk at work, brought it home sometimes when he knew you'd be out. We were careful." I looked up at her, and I saw something in her face I hadn't expected. Not triumph. Something closer to sadness. "Why?" It was all I could manage to say. She shrugged, and the casual gesture felt like another knife. "It just happened." Started as texting after that dinner where I supposedly threw myself at him, except that's not really what happened. We'd been flirting for months before that. The dinner was just when it became physical. "You're lying." "I'm not. Look at the dates on these messages. They start 4 months before that dinner." She leaned back. "That whole story he told you? About me trying to kiss him while you were on the phone? That was him creating cover, making sure when our affair eventually came out, there'd be this narrative of me being the aggressor. The diary, the documentation, the careful record-keeping. It all made horrible sense now. The affair was real, my mother said quietly. For 2 years, my sister confirmed. On and off, whenever we could manage it. He loved me. Maybe not enough to leave Vera, but enough to keep coming back. I felt something break inside me then. The man I'd married, the man I'd trusted completely, had been living a double life. While I'd been making him coffee every morning, believing in our marriage, he'd been sleeping with my sister. So, the baby, my father started, is his, my sister finished. Has to be. We were together constantly around the time I got pregnant. I stood up from the table. I need to leave. Wait. My sister's voice stopped me. That house, that money, half should go to his son. That's only fair. I turned back, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. We'll see, I said quietly, because she'd just made a critical mistake. She'd proven the affair was real, but in doing so, she'd assumed something that wasn't necessarily true. She'd assumed that affair meant paternity. I didn't remember driving home from my parents' house that night. One moment I was standing in their dining room, staring at photos of my husband with my sister, and the next I was sitting in my driveway, engine still running, unable to make myself go inside. The house we'd renovated together. The house where we'd made plans and dreamed about the future. Every room held memories that were now contaminated, poisoned by what I'd learned. I finally went inside around midnight, walked through rooms that felt unfamiliar, despite having lived there for years. The kitchen where we'd cooked together, the living room where we'd watched movies on Friday nights, the bedroom where I'd slept beside a man I thought I knew. I'd been grieving for a person who never existed. The faithful husband, the man who'd stood by me through infertility treatments, who'd held my hand through miscarriages. That man was a fiction, a performance he'd maintained while secretly carrying on with my sister. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. For 3 days, I barely moved from the couch, cycling through every interaction I could remember, looking for signs I'd missed. The times he'd worked late, the weekend he'd gone to that work conference that now, thinking back, I wasn't sure had ever really happened. How many times had I been in that Atlanta hotel room, calling to say goodnight, while he was making plans to spend the weekend with her? In our house? In our bed? My mother called repeatedly. My father texted, asking if I was okay. I didn't respond. What was there to say? The photos kept replaying in my mind. The easy intimacy between them, the way they looked comfortable together. My sister had been right about one thing. He'd loved her. Maybe not enough to leave me, but enough to keep choosing her. Again and again, for 2 years. I thought about the barbecue where I'd caught them standing close together, her hand on his arm. I'd asked him about it that night, and he'd lied so easily. How many other times had he lied? How many conversations had been complete fiction? The diary entries in the safe deposit box took on new meaning now. Those clinical, factual descriptions of my sister showing up places, they weren't documentation of harassment. They were documentation of an affair, carefully worded to sound innocent. Appeared at downtown coffee shop really meant they'd planned to meet there. Conversation on porch lasted 12 minutes was probably a fight about when they could see each other next. He'd been so smart about it, so careful. Every interaction documented in a way that made him look like the victim. The perfect cover story. And I'd believed it. Defended him. Took his side against my own sister. On the 4th day, I finally showered. Forced myself to eat something. My lawyer had left 2 voicemails asking about next steps. I couldn't bring myself to call back. What was I fighting for anymore? A house full of lies? Money that represented years of a marriage built on betrayal? Maybe my sister was right. Maybe she deserved half. She'd given him something I couldn't. A relationship without the weight of infertility, without the grief and disappointment. She'd been the escape from our complicated reality. I was sitting in the reading nook we'd built where the nursery should have been, looking out at the rose bushes he'd planted, when something shifted. A small, hard knot of anger that had been growing beneath the grief suddenly surfaced. My sister had slept with my husband for 2 years, had come to our house, sat at our table, held her baby while looking me in the eye and pretending to be family. She'd watched me grieve, watched me struggle with infertility, watched me put my life back together, and the whole time she was sleeping with him. And now she wanted half of what I had left, wanted to profit from her betrayal, to use the child she'd conceived while destroying my marriage as leverage to take my home. The rage was clean and sharp, cutting through the depression like a knife. My husband had betrayed me. Yes. He'd lied and cheated and lived a double life. But he was dead. I couldn't confront him, couldn't make him face what he'd done. But my sister was very much alive. And she'd made a critical error in her planning. She'd assumed the affair meant paternity. Assumed that because they'd been sleeping together, the baby must be his. It was a logical assumption, given the circumstances. But assumptions don't hold up in court. And biology doesn't care about logic or probability or how often people were together. I picked up my phone and finally called my lawyer back. "I need to see you," I said when he answered. "I have evidence about my husband's medical history. Something my sister doesn't know about." "What kind of evidence?" "The kind that proves her entire claim is impossible. No matter what else is true, no matter what actually happened between them, the baby isn't his, can't be his, and I can prove it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That changes everything." "Yes," I said, looking around the room at all the renovations we'd done together. "It does." My sister had won the affair. She'd gotten 2 years with my husband, had whatever relationship they'd built in secret. She'd taken something from me that could never be returned. But she wasn't going to take my house. Wasn't going to profit from her betrayal. Because for all his lies, my husband had left me one final gift. Medical proof that made paternity impossible. And I was going to use it. 2 days after calling my lawyer, I finally returned to the safe deposit box. I'd been avoiding it since that first visit, unable to face the documents my husband had so carefully compiled. Now I needed everything in there, not just the legal documents, but also the letter I'd been too afraid to read. The bank employee led me to the same private viewing room. I sat for a long moment before opening it, bracing myself. The medical records were on top. I pulled them out and read through them carefully this time, noting every detail. The surgical report from 4 years ago. The urologist's notes about the procedure being medically necessary. The follow-up appointment 8 months later confirming 0 sperm count. 4 years ago. My nephew had just turned 1, which meant he'd been conceived approximately 2 years ago. 2 years after the vasectomy that made my husband permanently sterile. The timeline was irrefutable. The biology was absolute. Beneath the medical records was the letter. I held it for a long time before finally opening it. "Vera," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I'm sorry you're facing whatever comes next without me. I know I haven't been the husband you deserved. I know I've made choices that would hurt you if you knew about them. But I need you to understand that everything in this box is meant to protect you. The will is legitimate. The medical records are accurate. Whatever anyone claims, whatever accusations they make, you have proof of the truth. The house is yours. The money is yours. Everything we built together is yours. Don't let anyone take it from you. Don't let guilt or grief or family obligation make you give up what's rightfully yours. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused. But I'm not sorry for making sure you'd be protected. I loved you, Vera. In my own flawed way, I did love you." I read it 3 times, trying to find meaning between the lines. He knew about the affair. Obviously, he was part of it. He knew my sister might try to claim paternity. He knew I'd need this documentation. But what the letter didn't say was almost more revealing. No confession of the affair. No apology for the specific betrayal. Just vague acknowledgement of choices and pain without naming what he'd actually done. Even in death, he couldn't quite bring himself to be fully honest. I gathered all the medical records and copies of the will, put everything in my bag. Then I drove straight to my lawyer's office. He was a man in his 50s who'd handled our estate planning from the beginning. I'd called ahead, so he was expecting me, had blocked off his afternoon. I spread everything on his conference table. The medical records, the will, the documentation my husband had compiled. Then I told him about the family dinner, about my sister's proof of the affair, about her claim that the baby was my husband's. He listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes. When I finished, he spent several minutes reviewing the medical records, cross-referencing dates. "This is remarkably thorough," he finally said. "Your husband was very careful about documentation. Can she still claim paternity? Even with proof that they had an affair? She can claim it, but she can't prove it. These medical records are unambiguous. A vasectomy of this type, performed this long ago, with follow-up confirmation of sterility, there's no legal or medical argument that could override this evidence." He tapped the pathology report. "The affair is irrelevant to the inheritance question. She could produce 1,000 photos and it wouldn't matter. Biology is biology. So the house stays mine. Completely. The will is legitimate and properly executed. Even if the baby were his, which these records prove is impossible, your husband left explicit instructions that everything goes to you." He paused. She has no legal standing because she can't establish paternity. I felt something loosen in my chest. What happens when I show her this? I'd recommend we approach it strategically. Request a DNA test using samples from your late husband, hair from a brush, clothing he wore. Present it as fairness, as giving her a chance to prove her claim. She'll likely agree, confident in the outcome. And when it comes back negative? Then we have grounds for a fraud claim, given that she presented a forged will. But honestly, I suspect once the DNA results are clear, she'll back down entirely. We spent another hour discussing strategy, timelines. He'd draft a formal letter proposing the DNA test. It was a trap, and we both knew it. She'd walk right into it, convinced by 2 years of an affair that paternity was guaranteed. She'd see the test as a formality, something that would finally prove she was right. She'd assume that affair meant paternity, that sleeping together automatically meant the child was his. But biology didn't work on assumptions, and her logic had one fatal flaw. She didn't know about the vasectomy, didn't know that for all their intimacy, my husband had been physically incapable of giving her the one thing she needed. Driving home, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the funeral. Not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. A sense that maybe I wasn't completely powerless. My sister had taken my husband's love, or whatever version of love he was capable of giving. She'd taken my trust in my marriage. She'd taken 2 years of intimacy that should never have existed. But she couldn't take my house, couldn't take what my husband and I had built together. Because for all his flaws, he'd left me the one weapon I needed. Medical proof that her entire claim was built on sand. She'd made one critical mistake. She'd confused having an affair with guaranteed paternity. And that mistake was going to cost her everything. My lawyer's formal letter arrived at my sister's apartment 3 days later, delivered by courier. The proposal was straightforward. We would conduct a DNA test using samples from my late husband to definitively establish paternity. If the test proved my nephew was his biological child, we would negotiate an appropriate settlement. If the test proved otherwise, my sister would drop all claims and face potential legal consequences for the forged will. She called me within an hour of receiving the letter. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. A DNA test? Her voice was sharp, but not worried. Fine, let's do it. I've been saying all along that he's the father. This will finally prove it. The results will be legally binding, I said carefully. If it's negative, you'll have to answer for the forged document. She laughed, actually laughed. It won't be negative. I know who my son's father is, Vera. I spent 2 years with him. I know exactly when my baby was conceived, and your husband was the only person I was with during that time. The confidence in her voice was absolute. She truly believed what she was saying. We'll need samples from my nephew for comparison, I said. A cheek swab. The testing facility will coordinate whatever you need. I have nothing to hide. Her voice turned bitter. Unlike you, clinging to this fantasy of your perfect marriage, you're going to lose, Vera. You're going to have to face the truth about who he really was. And then you're going to give me what my son deserves. She hung up before I could respond. My lawyer coordinated with a reputable DNA testing facility. I provided samples, hair from my husband's brush that still sat in our bathroom, a razor he'd used, even a toothbrush I'd been unable to throw away. The facility collected cheek swabs from my nephew through a neutral third party to ensure chain of custody. Then came the waiting. The testing facility said results would take 2 to 3 weeks. Each day felt interminable. My parents called repeatedly, trying to mediate, trying to find some compromise. My mother was particularly insistent that we could work this out without lawyers, without tests. This isn't about the money, she kept saying. This is about family, about that baby. He's innocent in all this. I know he's innocent, I'd replied. That's why I need to establish the truth, for his sake as much as anyone's. My father was quieter, more troubled. The affair had shaken his faith in my husband. I just want to know what really happened, he'd said. I want to understand how we got here. So do I'd told him honestly. My sister stayed away during those weeks. No surprise visits, no calls, no attempts at contact. She was waiting, confident in her position, probably already planning how she'd spend her half of the inheritance. I spent the time slowly going through my husband's belongings, boxing up clothes for donation, sorting through papers in his office. Every item carried double meaning now. Was this shirt the one he'd worn to meet her? Was this receipt from a dinner they'd shared? I found his secondary phone in his desk drawer, buried under old tax documents. The battery was dead, and I didn't try to charge it. I'd seen enough of those messages. 3 weeks and 2 days after the samples were collected, my lawyer called. "Results are in," he said without preamble. "DNA test is conclusive. Your late husband is not the biological father of your sister's child." I'd been expecting it, had known logically what the results would say, but hearing it confirmed still hit me with unexpected force. What's our next step? I'll notify her lawyer. She did retain counsel once the test was proposed. We'll present the results along with the medical records explaining why paternity was impossible. At that point, she'll have limited options. She'll accept, I said. She won't have a choice. The notification went out that afternoon. By evening, my phone was flooded with calls from my parents, from relatives who'd somehow heard the news. I ignored them all except my mother's final call, the one that came at almost midnight. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice small and broken. "The DNA test. Is it really negative?" "Yes." "But the affair was real. The photos were real," I confirmed. "The affair happened. But that doesn't change biology. He couldn't have been the father. The medical records prove it." Long silence. Then, "Your sister is devastated. She's completely fallen apart." "Good," I said, and meant it. She should be devastated. She destroyed my marriage, betrayed me for 2 years, and then tried to profit from it. Devastation is the least of what she deserves. She really believed. That's not my problem. She made assumptions. She was wrong. And now she has to face the consequences. Another silence. Then quietly, "What happens now?" "Now I keep my house. Keep what's rightfully mine. And your daughter learns that betrayal has costs." I hung up without saying goodbye. The affair had been real. My husband had betrayed me with my own sister for 2 years. That truth would always hurt. But my sister had made one critical mistake. She'd assumed that sleeping with my husband meant the child was his. She'd been so confident in the affair that she'd never considered the possibility that biology might have other plans. During those 2 years, she'd apparently still been sleeping with her boyfriend too. And when she'd gotten pregnant, she'd simply assumed it was the richer man. Greed and assumption had led her to forge a will, make public claims, and expose an affair that might have stayed hidden forever. And all of it for nothing, because the baby wasn't his. Had never been his. Could never have been his. The lawsuit was filed within a week of the DNA results. Fraud, forgery, attempted theft through deception. My lawyer had built an airtight case. The forged will alone was enough for criminal charges, but combined with the false paternity claim and the attempt to extract money based on that claim, my sister was facing serious legal consequences. Her lawyer tried to negotiate, suggested we settle quietly, avoid the publicity of a trial, let the family heal. But I wasn't interested in quiet settlements. "She made this public," I told my lawyer. "At my nephew's birthday party, in front of everyone. She wanted an audience for her accusations. She can have an audience for her downfall too." The preliminary hearing was held in a county courthouse on a gray Tuesday morning. My sister arrived looking nothing like the confident woman who'd presented photos at that family dinner. She looked hollow, diminished. Her lawyer stood to present their position. "My client acknowledges that the DNA test results show her son is not biologically related to the deceased. However, the relationship between my client and the deceased was real and documented. They maintained an intimate relationship for 2 years. The assumption of paternity was reasonable given the circumstances." "Reasonable doesn't make it true," my lawyer interrupted. "And the forgery charges have nothing to do with reasonable assumptions. Your client presented a fabricated legal document. That's fraud, regardless of any relationship they may have had." The judge looked at my sister. "Did you create a false will?" Long silence. Then quietly, "Yes." "Why?" She looked up, tears streaming down her face. "Real ones this time. Because I thought he was the father. I thought his son deserved something from him. The timing made sense, and we were together so much during that period, I just assumed." "You assumed," the judge repeated. "Despite being in a relationship with another man during the same time frame?" Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "For the biological father to be someone other than my husband, she had to have been sexually active with at least one other person during the conception window. I was seeing my boyfriend," she admitted, "but not as often. I was with him more." She gestured toward the empty chair where my husband would have sat. "I thought the baby had to be his. But you didn't verify this before forging legal documents and making public accusations." "No. And you understand that your assumption doesn't justify the forgery?" "Yes." The word was barely audible. The judge reviewed the medical records, the DNA results, the expert testimony about the vasectomy. Then she looked at my sister with something that might have been pity or disgust. "The court finds sufficient evidence to proceed with fraud charges." However, given the complexity of family circumstances, I'm recommending mediation before full prosecution. If the defendant agrees to formally withdraw all claims, make public acknowledgement of the fraud, and accept financial penalties, we may resolve this without a lengthy trial. My sister's lawyer immediately agreed to mediation. 3 weeks later, we sat in a conference room with a mediator, lawyers on both sides, and a settlement agreement that laid out exactly what would happen next. My sister would sign a formal declaration stating that she had forged the will, that her paternity claims were false, and that she had no legal or financial claims to my husband's estate. She would pay a fine of $15,000 for the attempted fraud, and she would stay away from me completely unless I initiated contact. What about family events? Her lawyer asked. I don't anticipate attending any family events where she's present, I said flatly. And if circumstances require we be in the same place, she stays on her side of the room, and I stay on mine. My mother, who'd shown up uninvited to the mediation, made a small sound of protest. This is tearing our family apart. She tore it apart, I said, not looking at her. She slept with my husband for 2 years. She watched me grieve him while knowing she'd betrayed me. She tried to take my home based on a lie. Don't talk to me about tearing families apart. My sister signed the documents without speaking, her hand shaking. When everything was finalized, she finally looked at me. I really thought he was the father, she said. The affair was real. What we had was real. I wasn't making that up. The affair was real, I agreed. And so was your betrayal. So was your decision to use that affair to try to take what didn't belong to you. The fact that you were wrong about paternity doesn't make any of that better. It just makes you stupid in addition to cruel. She flinched. Good. I wanted her to feel every word. I know you won't forgive me, she continued, voice breaking. But I need you to understand. I loved him. It wasn't just about money. I don't care, I interrupted. I don't care what you felt. You could have loved him completely, and it still wouldn't excuse what you did to me. I took nothing you really had, she shot back, anger flashing. He was already gone from your marriage. He was with me because he wanted to be. He was with you because you were easy, I said coldly. Because you were there and willing and too stupid to ask questions. He protected me even while betraying me, left me everything, documented everything. What does that tell you about how much he valued what you had together? The words hit their target. She collapsed back in her chair. We left separately. I heard later from my father that she'd called from her car, sobbing, begging them to talk to me. They'd refused, my parents finally drawing a line. What she did was unforgivable. My father told me that night. We can't support that. My sister's social circle collapsed within weeks. Word spread. People stopped returning calls. The salon let her go. She'd gambled everything on a lie built on an assumption, and she'd lost spectacularly. 6 months after the mediation, I still lived in the Victorian house that had become both my sanctuary and my prison. Every room held double memories now. The life I thought I'd lived and the reality that had existed beneath it. The kitchen where we'd cooked together while he texted my sister. The bedroom where we'd slept while he planned secret meetings. I kept the house, but it would never feel the same. Some days were better than others. I'd wake up and go through my routines, coffee, work, managing the estate affairs. Other days I couldn't get out of bed, crushed by the weight of grief and betrayal tangled together. Therapy helped, though not as much as I'd hoped. My therapist kept saying I needed to process 2 losses simultaneously, the death of my husband and the death of who I'd believed he was. That I was mourning both the person and the illusion. She was right, but knowing why something hurt didn't make it hurt less. I'd started renovating again, not because the house needed it, but because I needed to reclaim the space. Repainted the bedroom in colors he'd never seen, ripped out the rose bushes he'd planted and replaced them with lavender. Turned his home office into a yoga studio I never used, but that at least wasn't filled with his ghost. The inheritance was mine, complete and uncontested. The house, the life insurance, the retirement accounts, the savings, all of it. Legally, financially, I'd won. Emotionally, I wasn't sure anyone had won. I had money and property, but also the knowledge that my marriage had been a performance, my trust had been misplaced, my sister had betrayed me in the worst way possible. My sister, meanwhile, had lost everything that mattered. The fraud charges had been settled, but the social consequences were ongoing and severe. Friends had abandoned her once word spread about the affair and the forged will. Her boyfriend, the man who actually was my nephew's father, had left her shortly after the DNA results came out, unwilling to deal with the scandal. She'd moved in with our parents temporarily, a 30-year-old woman back in her childhood bedroom with a toddler. No job, no prospects, no reputation left to salvage. My mother reported that she barely left her room except to care for the baby, that the confident woman who'd orchestrated this whole disaster had completely collapsed. I felt no sympathy. She'd made her choices. She'd slept with my husband for 2 years, watched me grieve him, then tried to profit from both the affair and his death. My parents had tried, in their awkward way, to bridge the gap, suggested family therapy, offered to mediate conversations, hinted that maybe someday I'd find it in my heart to forgive. I'd shut down each attempt firmly. There would be no forgiveness, no reconciliation, no heartwarming moment where we all hugged and moved past this. Some betrayals were too deep to heal. Some damage was permanent. I saw my nephew occasionally, at carefully orchestrated handoffs where my mother would bring him to a park or neutral location. I refused to see my sister, but I wouldn't punish the child for his mother's sins. He was 2 now, talking in full sentences, completely oblivious to the chaos surrounding his existence. He looked nothing like my husband, I noticed. Had his actual father's features, his mother's coloring. No ghost of the man my sister had convinced herself was the father. He asks about you sometimes, my mother told me during one of these handoffs. Asks where you are, why you don't come to the house anymore. He's 2. He'll forget soon enough. Your sister asks about you too. I don't want to hear about her. My mother sighed. That particular sound of parental disappointment I'd heard my entire life. She's your sister, Vera. Family. That has to mean something. It meant something until she destroyed it. You don't get to sleep with someone's husband for 2 years and then claim family should forgive you. My father handled it differently. He'd shown up at my house one Saturday, unannounced, with tools and a determination to fix the porch railing that had been loose for months. We'd worked in silence for a while before he finally spoke. I failed you, he'd said, not looking at me. Let your sister get away with too much for too long. Yes, I'd agreed. No point in pretending otherwise. If I could go back, you can't. So this is what we have instead. We'd finished the repair without discussing it further. He'd hugged me before leaving, holding on longer than usual. The sealed letter from my husband, the one I'd read in the safe deposit box, stayed with me. I'd memorized every word. I loved you, Vera. In my own flawed way, I did love you. Maybe he had. Maybe in between the lies and the affair and all the betrayal, there had been some genuine feeling, or maybe that was just another lie. I'd never know. That was the worst part. All the questions I'd never get answers to. Why her? Why 2 years? Why stay married to me while pursuing her? The documentation he'd left behind protected me financially but answered nothing emotionally. He'd been strategic enough to get a vasectomy, careful enough to document it thoroughly, smart enough to know it might matter someday. But he hadn't been honest enough to end our marriage before starting something with my sister. So I had his money and his house and his careful legal protections. What I didn't have was closure or understanding. My sister had gambled on assumptions, that the affair meant paternity, that her confidence would be enough, that greed could overcome biology. She'd lost that gamble catastrophically. She'd have to explain to my nephew eventually why his aunt wouldn't speak to his mother, why family gatherings didn't include everyone, why there was this fracture that could never be repaired. And me, I'd have to live with the knowledge that I'd been betrayed by the 2 people who should have been most loyal. The house was mine. The money was mine. The future was mine to build. But it would be built on ashes of trust that could never be restored, in a family that would never heal, carrying scars that would never fade. My sister had learned that greed has costs, that assumptions aren't facts, that betrayal destroys everything. I'd learned that love and loyalty weren't guarantees, that family could hurt you worse than strangers, that sometimes the only protection you have is documentation and biology and the cold comfort of being legally right even when emotionally devastated. We'd both learned our lessons. Neither of us had won, but at least I still had the house.